I'm back with round 9 coverage of the 44th FIDE Chess Olympiad 2022, and I'm going to be highlighting the US against Greece match. And this is going to be board number 1, Fabiano Caruana with the black pieces against Dimitrios Mastrovisais. And this is a really nice game, and I think it's a nice aggressive game by Fabiano. He's needed to turn his event around. He hasn't done that great so far. And we see a Sicilian, so he's looking to play aggressive. Pawn on c5 right away on move 1. And we get kind of this double-edged Sveshnikov opening. The Sveshnikov became pretty famous when Magnus Carlsen played it in his World Championship match against Fabiano. So we get to see a Sveshnikov with Fabiano on the black side. And here you see black's expanding on the queen side. Black has a stronghold on e5. But the downside for black is this pawn on d6. So we're already kind of thinking about positional imbalances here. White has the pawn on d6 to target, but black gets this nice queenside expansion, and as we're going to see, kingside expansion as well. So right here, the common idea for white, you need to avoid this fork of the two knights, is to trade on f6, which white does, g takes f, and then stick a knight in on d5. That knight outpost is really hard for black to get rid of because there's no black pawns on c7 or e7 that can move up to kick the knight. So really the only way that black can get rid of that knight is to try to offer a trade for this knight or for this bishop. And then if you look at the pawn structure, black now has this set of doubled pawns, and there's not a real safe place for the king because this looks very exposed on the g file. Maybe white could attack the black king. But on the flip side, the reason black plays this type of structure is it's aggressive. Black can actually play for pawn to f5, targeting the e4 pawn. Then sometimes black takes, sometimes black pushes. And then you start to see, okay, maybe the rook comes to the g file. Maybe black gets a little bit of a kingside attack going, right? So we already talked about black having this queenside advantage with the pawns. Now black gets a potential kingside advantage. The downside for black, though, king stuck in the middle. All right, f5 by Fabi. Bishop to d3. Nice and solid. Bishop to e6. Castle. Bishop to g7. Another thing to note here is Fabiano does have the bishop pair, so add that to the list of imbalances, meaning Fabiano would like to open up this position a bit, give those bishops more scope. And Dimitrios wants to keep the position closed, keep that knight on d5, maybe reroute this knight over to e3 even, bring some backup onto this d5 square. Oftentimes you'll see too, white might play c3 and a4 as a way to chip away at that pawn structure with the white bishop pointing at those pawns. So really interesting strategic battle so far, 12 moves in. Now we see queen to h5 by white, and I think white does have a small advantage here. Black has to prove that there's enough compensation for these weaknesses in the pawn structure. Rook to b8, and now we do see this move pawn to c3, just slowing down the b pawn. Pawn to f4 by Fabi. So when you see a pawn chain like this, pointing towards the opponent's king, that's usually a sign of aggression, right? Fabiano wants to bring those pieces towards the white king, and this pawn formation, the pawn diagonal pointing at the white king, kind of highlights that. That tells you that white is going, or excuse me, black is going for that plan. Knight to c2. And this knight might also head to b4, just another way to support its friend on d5. And there we see it. And black trades off a pair of knights. So Fabiano trades off a pair of knights, and now we just get this bishop pair against bishop and knight imbalance. Rook to d1. Makes sense, lining it up with the d-pawn. a5 by Fabi, and now the other knight sinks into d5. So the first thing you might be wondering is, can black get away with bishop takes d5? That's a super powerful knight there, right? What happens if we take? It's a playable move, but after e takes d5, it's just slightly annoying that this bishop hits the h-pawn. So black has to play a move like h6, and now you got to think about queen to f5. And even though there's not quite a checkmate here, this is something where white's finally getting to attack the exposed black king, and I don't think that's what Fabiano wants in this position. So he leaves that knight on d5 and instead retreats the queen. Bishop back to c2, king to h8. I like this decision. So now the rook is coming to g8, and black is ready to start applying some pressure to the white king. Now, one thing to think about from the white side here is, what is your plan? right? So initially, white was trying to attack with the queen, post the knight up on a good square, kind of go for a kingside attack. But at this point, we see that black has a pretty clear kingside attack himself. Fabiano has some plans, starting with rook to g8. So what white has to figure out is, how does white counteract this very straightforward plan by black? Can you get these rooks into the game? And what he decides to do is apply the pressure on the d6 pawn, starting with rook to d2. This makes a lot of sense to me. Rook to g8. And now we see rook to d1. White doubles the rooks on the d file. But one thing to note here is the kingside attack is actually coming a little bit faster than this pressure on the d pawn. And I think white didn't quite see this coming, because look at the move that Fabiano plays here. Bishop to h6. What a beautiful move. It looks like a straight sacrifice of a bishop. So let's look at that. What if queen takes h6? Rook to g6, attacking the queen, preparing to potentially double on the g file, right? If a rook or queen gets here, there's now two pieces lined up with that pawn on g2. All right, so let's say the queen retreats. Queen to h5. There's an escape route for that black queen. Not so fast. Bishop to g4. Now look at every potential square for the queen. Guarded by the rook, guarded by the king. The queen guards these two squares. The rook guards the bishop guards this square, and all of these squares the queen can't cut through. Bishop guards this. That white queen is actually trapped. So this line does not work for white. Very cool move, bishop to h6, and I don't think Dimitrios saw that coming. So he plays pawn to h3, and I think he's just doing that to prevent bishop to g4 ideas. Now that queen's ready to escape. Rook to g6 by Fabi. Queen back to f3, logical looking move, and look at the eval bar drop. Interestingly, if you look at the eval bar here, it's 2.1. I make the move. It takes a second or two to actually register black's attack here. But this is a winning attack for Fabiano, so let's see if he finds it. Queen to h4, that's the top move. Just bringing another piece towards the white king, and now all of a sudden, look at this. We got bishop, rook, and queen, 3 attackers for 1 defender, and we have another attacker right here ready to come into the game. King f1. This is a tactical mistake. I think it's logical to still play king f1. Like, there's really nothing else that white can do. So maybe the tactical mistake actually came back on queen to f3, where the eval bar dropped. But the problem after king f1, and Fabiano finds this brilliant move, is rook takes g2. What a sacrifice. White cannot survive by just allowing that rook to stay there. So you have to take with either king or queen. In the game, king takes g2 was played, so let's look at what happens if queen takes g2. Bishop takes h3, pinning the queen to the king. That's GG. That's good game. Can't do that. All right, let's go with the game line. King takes g2. There's only one move here that's winning for black. The rest are winning for white. And the move is rook to g8 check. The king moves to f1. You might be wondering, what if the king goes the other direction? What if king to h2? Because we have queen and king both guarding this h pawn. There's no entry points for the rook. This is something that I could see being played in one of my games. Bishop to g4 is the response. And the problem is, this queen doesn't have many safe squares. The rook on d1 is also attacked. So like if queen here, for example, trying to guard at h3, there's bishop takes d1, exposing the white queen. And if queen to d3 is played, natural looking move, it's a forced checkmate in 5 after pawn to f3. This h pawn is dying. This is now opened up. The rook is still cutting off g. Forced checkmate in 5. So king to h2, not playable. King to h1 doesn't make sense because it's just dropping this pawn. Bishop takes h3, and then you're going to be opened up to a discovered check. So king to f1 played. Bishop takes h3, the king runs, and now bishop to g2, very strong move by Fabi. Bishop to g4 is also perfectly good, creating the skewer. Rook to d3, so white is sacrificing the queen. Technically here, white is +3 on material, and he is giving back 6 points, bishop for rook. And the reason he's going for this line is if you look at the resulting material, there is still a rook and a knight for white against the queen for black. Black just happens to have a couple extra pawns as well. So it's a pretty big advantage for black in this case. Bishop takes, rook g2. So we get this imbalance. Bishop g5. And what Fabiano needs to do is see if he can get these extra pawns involved. If the f pawn trades off for the e pawn, for example, maybe black's e pawn can start rushing up the board. But a decent plan is to just keep pushing the h pawn, which is a passed pawn already. Bishop to d1, trying to hold everything. Pawn to f5, nice move. Creating this tension. That e4 pawn is kind of the stronghold for white's defense. If this pawn falls, black is going to break through. So white decides, okay, let's put the bishop back on c2. We'll allow black to take. Rook to h2 played. Pawn takes. And now rook to h3. This is a very sneaky maneuver. Rook to h2, the whole idea is rook to h3, and there's just no good way for white to defend this. So he opens up the e4 square to try to bring the bishop in for the defense. But after rook takes, bishop takes, queen takes, now e4 is coming, and white just resigns this position. White wants no more of this. There's not a great move here. If rook to d1 is played, pawn to e4, and if the bishop tries to escape, pawn to f3, and this is a forced checkmate in 6 moves. Queen's coming to h3 with back rank mate, attacking the bishop. White's not getting any counterplay in this position. So beautiful game by Fabiano. Sacrifices a bishop first, and then he sacrifices a rook with a crushing attack. And usually we don't see Fabiano play this aggressively straight out of the opening, but I think he had a chip on his shoulder. He wanted to bounce back. He actually had lost 2 games in a row going into this one. He lost to Sargsyan from Armenia, and he lost to Gukeshdi from India too. He fought back, he bounced back, and got this win. All right, so now let's shift over and look at the standings after round 9. We have Uzbekistan with 16 points, which means they have 8 team match wins, 8 team match points out of 9. India 2 and Armenia both have 7.5 out of 9. And if we look at the US, they're down here with 7 out of 9. Pretty big tie. Places 4 through 10, all tied with 7 out of 9. I want to look at the Uzbekistan team. Let's see how well their players are doing. They have the youngster Nordabek on board 1. Performance rating 2783. That's a whole 100 points higher than his rating. We have another Nordabek on board 2 who's playing at a 2786. That's 160 points above his rating. And board 3 is playing at 2700. Board 4, Vakidov, is 2820 performance rating. He's just crushing it on board number 4. And board 5, these two players are 2500, is playing at a 2755 rating. So Uzbekistan is really outperforming their ratings. They have Sokolov as their coach, super strong player and opening theoretician. That's an exciting team to watch. India 2, one of my favorite teams, sitting comfortably in second place, 15 points. And the tiebreak 2, remember, that's based on the number of points your opponent teams score. This is sort of like a tiebreak in individual events. It drops out the lowest team. I think you get full points for teams you beat, half the points for teams you draw, no points for the teams you lose to. So we can see Uzbekistan and India 2 have very high tiebreaks as well, outside of the match points. All right, so what are we looking at for round 10 pairings? We have India 2 on board 1 against Uzbekistan. That's going to be a really good matchup. I think India 2 could win this one, but it's an 11 seed against a 14 seed. So by rating, they're pretty close. And Uzbekistan is actually outperforming India 2 a little bit up until this point. Board 2, we have Azerbaijan against Armenia. That'll be a really good one. In board 3, we have the US against Turkey. This is a really good chance, I think, for the US to come away with a win and try to catch up to the leaders. Turkey is the 21 seed. So because we have all these ties, there are some bigger mismatches here, or bigger rating discrepancies, I should say. None of them are really a mismatch. We have like India against Iran. That's a 2 seed against a 13 seed. Serbia, Netherlands, that's a 7 against 23. And Spain and Czech Republic are down on the lower score group. So boards 1 through 5, I think those are the boards to watch in tomorrow's round. Let me know in the comments, which team do you want to see win? And if there's any particular player or team you want me to highlight, keep letting me know in the comments. I'll check out their games, put them in contention for the next review video. So thanks for watching. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're not. We'll see you in the next video.